In 1885, a homesteader's wife in Nebraska could butcher a hog, render the lard, make soap from the leftovers, and still have supper on the table by sundown. She did not Google it. She did not watch a tutorial. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers. Today, we pay strangers on the internet to teach us how to boil an egg. Number 14 on this list was so effective that an entire billion-dollar industry was invented just to replace it. Number 3 involves a technique that modern food scientists now say preserves nutrients better than anything in your refrigerator. These were not hobbies. These were survival skills that kept families fed, clothed, and alive on the American frontier. And corporations spent a century making sure you forgot every single one of them. Before we start, hit that subscribe button because what you are about to hear might change how you look at every product in your kitchen. Let us count down the 25 lost pioneer woman skills that held every American family together. Number 25th, reading the sky for weather. Before the National Weather Service, before radio forecasts, before your phone told you to bring an umbrella, pioneer women read the sky the way you read a text message. A ring around the moon meant rain within 48 hours. A deep red sunset promised fair weather tomorrow. When the leaves on cottonwood trees flipped silver side up, a storm was coming fast and the washing had to come off the line. These were not superstitions. Modern meteorologists have confirmed that most of these observations are scientifically accurate. The halo around the moon is caused by ice crystals in high cirrus clouds that precede a warm front. Leaf flipping happens when humidity changes air pressure around the stems. Pioneer women did not know the science. They knew the results, and those results meant the difference between a dry hay harvest and a ruined one, between safe shelter and a family caught in a plains thunderstorm miles from home. We lost this skill the moment we started trusting an app more than our own eyes. Number 24, soap making from kitchen scraps. Every pioneer kitchen kept an ash hopper outside the back door and a fat jar beside the stove. When your great-great-grandmother made soap, she poured water through hardwood ashes to make lye, then combined it with saved cooking grease, tallow, or lard. The mixture was boiled in a cast iron kettle over an open fire and stirred for hours with a wooden paddle until it thickened and saponified. One batch produced enough soap to last a family of 8 for 3 months. The cost was nothing. Literally nothing. She made cleaning products from garbage. That lye soap cleaned clothes, scrubbed floors, washed hair, and treated poison ivy. It contained no fragrance, no dye, no preservative. Dermatologists today are telling patients with eczema to switch to simple, lye-based soaps because modern body washes strip the skin barrier. Procter & Gamble was founded in 1837, selling exactly this kind of soap. Then, they spent the next century convincing America that homemade soap was primitive, and you needed their factory version instead. Your grandmother was not primitive. She was a chemist who worked for free. Number 23, candle dipping. Before kerosene lamps and long before Edison, the pioneer woman made light itself. She rendered tallow from beef suet or saved bacon grease, melted it in a deep pot, and dipped cotton wicks over and over, building up layers, one thin coat at a time. 20 dips made a candle thick enough to burn for 4 hours. A full day of dipping produced enough candles to light the cabin through winter. Children held the wick sticks, spacing the candles so they would not touch. The kitchen smelled like warm fat and beeswax when the family kept hives. Those candles meant everything. They meant reading scripture after dark. They meant mending clothes by firelight. They meant a mother could check on a sick child at midnight without stumbling through blackness. When paraffin candles showed up in general stores for a few cents each, the skill vanished within a generation. Nobody missed it until the power went out. Number 22, wild plant identification for food and medicine. A pioneer woman could walk a fence line and come back with dinner in a pharmacy. She knew that dandelion greens were more nutritious than anything in her garden. She knew that plantain leaves, the weed you spray with Roundup, drew infection out of wounds. She knew that willow bark tea contained the same compound as aspirin. She knew that elderberry syrup fought winter coughs better than any patent medicine the peddler sold from his wagon. This was not folk nonsense. The U.S. Pharmacopoeia listed over 600 plant-based medicines well into the 1900s. Pharmaceutical companies did not invent new cures. They isolated compounds that pioneer women had been using for generations, patented them, and charged money. Aspirin is willow bark. Digoxin is foxglove. The knowledge was free. The pill costs $18. We stopped teaching our children to identify plants and started teaching them to read labels instead. Modern Americans panic when the power goes out for 6 hours. A pioneer woman managed fire 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, because fire was life. She banked coals at night, covering them with ash so they would smolder until morning. She knew which woods burned hot and fast for cooking, which burned slow for heating, and which made too much smoke for an enclosed cabin. She could start a fire with flint and steel in under 2 minutes, even in wind. She taught her daughters to arrange kindling in a teepee shape, to split fat wood from pine knots for a guaranteed catch, and to never ever let the fire go completely out in January. If the fire died, the family could die with it. There was no thermostat, no backup furnace, no emergency number to call. Fire management was the single most critical daily skill on the frontier, and every woman in the household mastered it before she mastered reading. Number 20. Bread baking without measurements. Pioneer women did not own measuring cups. They did not have kitchen scales. They baked bread by feel. A handful of salt, enough flour until the dough stopped sticking. Yeast starter kept alive in a crock on the windowsill, fed weekly with flour and water like a family pet. She judged oven temperature by holding her hand inside and counting. 3 seconds meant hot enough for biscuits. 5 seconds meant right for a slow loaf. The dough told her what it needed. Too sticky, more flour. Too stiff, wet hands and knead again. She could feel when the gluten developed, when the rise was right, when the crust would crack golden instead of pale. A pioneer wife baked between 8 and 12 loaves a week for a family of 6. That is over 500 loaves a year, every single one made without a recipe card. Modern bakers measure to the gram and still get dense, sad loaves that would have embarrassed a 12-year-old girl on the Oregon Trail. Number 19, seasonal food preservation. When harvest came, the pioneer woman became a one-woman factory. She had roughly 6 weeks to put up enough food to keep her family alive through 5 months of winter. Green beans were pressure canned in mason jars. Corn was cut from the cob, blanched and dried on wooden frames in the sun. Apples were sliced thin and strung on thread, hanging from the kitchen rafters like garlands. Cucumbers went into salt brine. Cabbage was shredded and packed into crocks for sauerkraut. Tomatoes were stewed, strained, and sealed with paraffin wax. Meat was smoked, salted, or dried into jerky. A well-stocked root cellar held between 400 and 600 jars of preserved food by October, organized by type, each one labeled with the date in pencil on a strip of cloth. That root cellar was the family's insurance policy. No grocery store, no supply chain. If she failed at preserving, her children went hungry in February. That pressure created excellence. And that excellence was erased by a can opener and a Kroger. Number 18, lard rendering and use. When the hog was butchered in November, the pioneer woman claimed the fat. She cut the leaf lard from around the kidneys, chopped it into small pieces, and rendered it slowly in a heavy pot over low heat. The cracklings that remained were salted and eaten as snacks or pressed into cornbread. The pure white lard was strained through cheesecloth into ceramic crocks and stored in the root cellar, where it kept for months. That lard went into everything. Pie crusts, so flaky they shattered at the touch of a fork. biscuits that rose tall and tender, fried chicken with a golden crust that modern restaurants cannot replicate no matter how hard they try. Lard was also used for moisturizer, leather conditioning, lamp fuel, and waterproofing boots. One pig produced enough lard to last a family an entire year. Then Crisco arrived in 1911. Procter & Gamble, the same soap company, marketed hydrogenated cottonseed oil as cleaner, more modern, and more digestible than lard. Doctors now tell us that the trans fats in early Crisco were far more dangerous than the lard it replaced. Your great-grandmother's pie crust was healthier than yours. She just never had to prove it. Number 17, quilting for survival, not decoration. A pioneer woman did not quilt because it was cute. She quilted because her family would freeze without bedding, and store-bought blankets cost more than a month's wages. She saved every scrap of worn-out clothing, flour sacks, and fabric remnants. She pieced them together in patterns not for beauty, though beauty came naturally, but for maximum coverage with minimum waste. A single quilt took 300 to 500 hours of hand stitching, often done in the evening by candlelight after the children were asleep. The batting inside was carded wool or cotton, layered thick enough to insulate against prairie nights that dropped to 20 below zero. Quilting bees were not social clubs. They were labor cooperatives, where women pooled their time to get critical work done faster. A bride needed at least 6 quilts before her wedding, or she was considered unprepared for marriage. The skill required geometry, material science, and an endurance that modern craft culture has romanticized beyond recognition. Twice a day, every day, the pioneer woman milked the cow. The fresh milk was carried in pails to the spring house or root cellar, where shallow pans let the cream rise overnight. She skimmed the cream by hand and collected it in a crock until she had enough to churn. Churning took between 30 minutes and 2 hours of repetitive motion, working the dasher up and down until the fat globules clumped into butter. She washed the butter in cold water to remove the buttermilk, which would cause it to spoil. She worked in salt with a wooden paddle, then pressed it into molds. The leftover buttermilk was used for biscuits, pancakes, or fed to the hogs. Nothing wasted. One good dairy cow produced enough milk for butter, cheese, cream, and drinking for a family of 8. The pioneer woman managed this entire supply chain alone, every single day, without refrigeration. Land O'Lakes would like you to believe butter comes from a factory. It comes from a woman who never sat down. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. The pioneer woman did not just cook and clean, she was the family pharmacist. Before there was a drugstore within 100 miles, she grew a medicinal herb garden as deliberately as she grew food. Chamomile for colic, peppermint for stomach cramps, comfrey poultices for broken bones, which is why old-timers called it knit bone, feverfew for headaches, lavender tucked into pillows for sleepless children. She dried these herbs in bundles hung from the kitchen rafters, and she kept a handwritten journal of remedies passed down from her mother and grandmother. Modern pharmaceutical research has validated dozens of these remedies. A 2011 study published in the journal Phytomedicine confirmed that chamomile extract has measurable anxiolytic effects. Peppermint oil is now recognized by the FDA as a treatment for irritable bowel syndrome. These women were not guessing. They were practicing medicine with a success rate that would embarrass a rural clinic. We traded their knowledge for a CVS receipt that is 4 feet long. Number 14, tallow candle and soap economy. This entry built an industry. A single beef cow rendered enough tallow to produce every candle and every bar of soap a family needed for a year. The pioneer woman wasted nothing from the slaughter. Fat was sorted, rendered, and divided between candle making and soap making with mathematical precision. She calculated how many candles would be needed per month based on the hours of darkness in each season. She knew exactly how many bars of soap her family used between wash days. This was supply chain management before the term existed. When commercial soap companies realized they could sell factory soap cheaper than tallow, they did not just offer a product. they waged a cultural campaign to make homemade soap seem backward and unsanitary. The same companies now sell natural tallow soap bars for $12 each. The pioneer woman made it for free. The industry that replaced her charges you for the privilege of buying back what she threw away. Number 13. Seed saving and selection. Every autumn, the pioneer woman walked her garden and selected the best performing plants for next year's seed. She chose the tomato that ripened earliest, the bean plant that produced the most pods, the corn stalk that stood tallest. She dried those seeds carefully, labeled them, and stored them in cloth bags in a cool, dry place. Over generations, this selective saving created locally adapted varieties that outperformed anything a catalog could sell. Those seeds were bred for her specific soil, her climate, her altitude. They were living records of her family's agricultural history. Then, commercial seed companies arrived. Hybrid seeds produced impressive first-generation yields, but could not be saved because the second generation reverted to inferior parent stock. Farmers became dependent on buying new seed every year. A skill that had sustained agriculture for 10,000 years was dismantled in a single generation. Today, saving seed from patented varieties can result in a lawsuit. The pioneer woman owned her food supply. We rent ours. The smokehouse stood in every pioneer farmyard, usually a small log or stone building with a dirt floor and no windows. After the November hog killing, the pioneer woman salted hams, shoulders, and bacon slabs, packed them in salt for weeks, then hung them in the smokehouse over smoldering hickory, apple, or mesquite. The smoking process took days, sometimes weeks, depending on the cut. Low, steady smoke at around 80 degrees preserved the meat while adding flavor that modern liquid smoke cannot begin to approximate. A properly smoked ham lasted through summer without refrigeration. The chemistry is now well understood. Smoke contains formaldehyde, acetic acid, and phenolic compounds that inhibit bacterial growth and prevent fat oxidation. The pioneer woman did not know the chemistry. She knew the ham was still good in July. That was enough. When mechanical refrigeration arrived, the smokehouse became a garden shed. We traded centuries of preservation knowledge for a Frigidaire and a sell-by date. Number 11. Wool processing from sheep to garment. The pioneer woman sheared the sheep, washed the raw fleece, carded the wool into roll lugs, spun it on a wheel into yarn, and then knit or wove it into clothing. Start to finish, she turned a dirty animal into a warm pair of socks. The entire process could take weeks for a single garment. Carding alone, the process of combing tangled fibers into parallel strands, took hours of repetitive handwork. Spinning required coordination, rhythm, and a practiced eye to keep the yarn consistent. A pioneer woman who could spin fine, even yarn, was respected the way a skilled surgeon is respected today. That yarn became stockings, mittens, scarves, blankets, and undergarments. Nothing was purchased that could be made. The spinning wheel sat in the corner of every cabin, and the sound of it turning was the background music of American frontier life. We do not even know what our clothes are made of now. We check a tag sewn in by someone on another continent. Second pattern break. Now here is where it gets personal. The pioneer woman was her family's teacher. Before public schooling reached the frontier, she taught her children to read using the family Bible, often the only book in the house. She taught arithmetic with dried beans on the kitchen table. She taught history through stories told by the fire after supper. A woman who could not read would walk 10 miles to borrow a primer so her children could learn. Literacy rates among pioneer children were remarkably high, given the circumstances, because their mothers treated education like a survival skill, which it was. A child who could read a land deed would not be cheated. A child who could do figures would not be shortchanged at the general store. The pioneer woman understood that knowledge was the one thing no drought, no fire, and no swindle could take from her family. Number 9. Egg preservation in water glass. Before refrigerators, the pioneer woman preserved eggs for months using sodium silicate called water glass. She mixed 1 part water glass with 9 parts boiled, cooled water in a large stoneware crock. Fresh, unwashed eggs were gently lowered in, pointy end down, and submerged completely. The sodium silicate sealed the porous shell, preventing air and bacteria from entering. Eggs preserved this way stayed edible for 6 months or longer. A flock of 12 hens produced abundantly in spring and summer, but slowed or stopped laying in winter. Water glassing meant the family had eggs for baking and breakfast through January and February, when the hens gave nothing. The technique worked so well that the United States Department of Agriculture recommended it in official bulletins through the 1940s. We forgot it completely when electric refrigerators became standard. Now homesteaders are rediscovering water glass on YouTube and acting like it is some kind of revelation. It is not a revelation. It is a memory. Number 8. Root cellaring. The root cellar was the pioneer woman's refrigerator, freezer, and pantry combined. Dug into a hillside or beneath the cabin floor, it maintained a steady temperature between 32 and 40 degrees year-round through nothing but the insulating properties of earth. She stored potatoes in straw, carrots in damp sand, and apples wrapped individually in newspaper so one rotten fruit would not spoil the barrel. Onions hung in braids from the ceiling. Cabbages were pulled up, roots and all, and hung upside down. Squash and pumpkins sat on wooden shelves, never touching each other. Every item had its place, its ideal humidity, its specific storage method. A well-managed root cellar kept produce edible from October through April. The pioneer woman understood microclimates, humidity control, and ethylene gas sensitivity without ever learning those terms. She knew that apples stored near potatoes made the potatoes sprout faster. Scientists confirmed the ethylene connection decades later. She was right. She was always right. Number 7. A pioneer woman's cast iron skillet was her most prized kitchen possession, often carried across the country in a covered wagon and passed down through 3 or 4 generations. She seasoned it by rubbing thin layers of lard or tallow into the hot iron, building up a polymer coating that made it virtually non-stick. That skillet was never washed with soap. It was wiped clean, heated dry, and given a thin coat of fat after every use. The seasoning improved with age. A grandmother's skillet cooked better than a new one because it carried decades of accumulated seasoning. Food scientists have analyzed this process and confirmed that the fat polymerizes at high heat, creating a coating chemically similar to the non-stick coatings on modern pans, but without the synthetic chemicals. A well-seasoned cast iron skillet from 1870 outperforms a brand new Teflon pan, and it will outlast it by 200 years. We threw away indestructible cookware and replaced it with pans that peel after 18 months. Before commercial yeast came in packets, the pioneer woman captured wild yeast from the air itself. She mixed flour and water in a crock, left it uncovered for days, and waited for the natural yeast present in the environment to colonize the mixture. Once it bubbled and smelled sour, she had a sourdough starter that would leaven bread for years if she kept feeding it. Some families carried their starter across the Great Plains in covered wagons, keeping the crock warm against their bodies at night so the yeast would not die. Starters were named. They were shared between neighbors. They were included in wills. A starter that had been alive for 20 years produced bread with a complexity of flavor that commercial yeast cannot touch. Modern sourdough bakeries charge $8 a loaf for what every pioneer cabin produced daily for free. The yeast was literally floating in the air. All she had to do was catch it. Number 5. Mending and darning. A pioneer woman never threw away a garment. She patched trousers with scraps from outgrown shirts. She darned socks over a wooden egg, weaving new thread into worn heels until the sock was more repair than original. She turned collars on men's shirts when one side frayed, giving the garment another year of life. Children's clothes were made large and hemmed up, then let down as the child grew. When clothes were finally too worn to mend, the fabric was cut into quilt squares or braided into rugs. Buttons were saved in jars. Zippers did not exist yet, but hooks, snaps, and ties were salvaged and reused. A single dress might last 10 years through careful mending. Today, we throw away 81 pounds of clothing per person per year. The average American garment is worn 7 times before it is discarded. The pioneer woman would have considered that a form of insanity. The pioneer woman soaked dried corn kernels in lye water made from hardwood ash, transforming them into hominy through a process called nixtamalization. The lye dissolved the tough outer hull and released niacin, a B vitamin, locked inside the kernel that the human body could not otherwise access. Without this process, communities that relied heavily on corn developed pellagra, a devastating niacin deficiency that killed thousands in the American South in the early 1900s. The pioneer women who made hominy never knew the word nixtamalization. They learned the technique from Native American women who had perfected it over thousands of years. They knew that treated corn kept families healthier than plain cornmeal. When industrial corn processing replaced home preparation, the lye step was skipped because it was slow and labor-intensive. Pellagra epidemics followed almost immediately. We removed the step that kept people alive because it was inconvenient. Modern food science now calls nixtamalization one of the most important food processing discoveries in human history. Pioneer women just called it making hominy. Number 3, Lacto fermentation of vegetables. Before canning jars and pressure cookers, the pioneer woman preserved vegetables through lacto fermentation, a technique so effective that modern food scientists rank it superior to most preservation methods for nutrient retention. She packed shredded cabbage with salt into stoneware crocks, pressed it down until the natural juices rose above the surface, and covered it with a cloth and a weighted plate. Over weeks, beneficial lactobacillus bacteria converted the sugars into lactic acid, creating an environment where harmful bacteria could not survive. The same process worked for cucumbers, green beans, beets, and turnips. The resulting sauerkraut and pickles lasted all winter without refrigeration and contained more bioavailable vitamins than the fresh vegetables they started as. A 2022 Stanford study found that fermented foods significantly increase gut microbiome diversity and reduce markers of inflammation. The pioneer woman did not have a Stanford study. She had a crock, some salt, and the accumulated wisdom of every woman who came before her. Number 2, water management and well maintenance. Water was the resource that determined whether a homestead survived or failed, and the pioneer woman managed it with an expertise that modern Americans cannot comprehend. She knew which spring ran clean and which carried minerals that sickened livestock. She tested well water by smell and taste before her family drank it. She rationed wash water across multiple uses, cleanest clothes first, then dirtier loads, and then the water went to the garden. She collected rainwater in barrels for soft water washing that preserved fabric. She understood that standing water bred mosquitoes and illness, so she kept barrels covered and drainage ditches clear. She boiled drinking water during illness outbreaks decades before germ theory was widely accepted. A pioneer woman did not call it water management. She called it keeping her children alive. Number 1, community coordination and mutual aid. This is the skill that held everything together. The pioneer woman organized barn raisings, coordinated harvest crews, managed food exchanges between families, and maintained the social networks that turned isolated homesteads into functioning communities. When a neighbor's wife fell ill, she sent her oldest daughter with soup, and she took in the younger children. When a new family arrived, she brought bread, and she showed the wife where the clean water ran and which berries were safe to eat. She tracked who owed what to whom, not in dollars, but in days of labor, bushels of corn, and jars of preserves. She knew that no single family could survive alone on the frontier, and she built the systems that made mutual survival possible. This was not charity, it was infrastructure. It was the invisible architecture that held American communities together before institutions existed to do it. When we moved to cities and suburbs, we outsourced community to government agencies and insurance companies. We stopped knowing our neighbors' names. We stopped showing up with soup when someone was sick. The pioneer woman's most important skill was not any single craft. It was the ability to build a world where people took care of each other because survival demanded it, and that might be the skill we need to relearn most of all. Here is my challenge to you. Pick one skill from this list, just one. Learn to ferment a jar of sauerkraut. Season a cast iron skillet properly. Save seeds from your garden this fall. Learn 3 wild plants growing in your own yard. Start a sourdough starter this weekend. Then come back here and tell me what happened. Tell me if your great-grandmother was just being old-fashioned, or if she knew something that 100 years of convenience has made us forget. I tried the water glass eggs last spring. I fermented my own sauerkraut last October. I am never going back. Share which skill you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the sourdough starters get more love than the root cellar tips. These were not quaint hobbies. They were the skills that built this country. And every corporation that made you forget them owes your grandmother an apology.